Elizabeth Morrison wiped the sweat from her forehead as she walked beside the creaking wagon. The autumn sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail, and her long dress clung uncomfortably to her legs. She was 19, with calloused hands. That told the story of farm life back in Ohio. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, though strands kept escaping in the mountain wind. "Lizzie, come sit with me," her mother Mary called from the wagon seat. "Your feet must be aching something fierce." Elizabeth shook her head with a tired smile. "Walking's easier than bouncing around on that hard bench, Mama. Besides, the wagon's already carrying too much weight." It was true. Their wagon groaned under the load of everything they owned: farming tools, cooking pots, clothes, food supplies, and her father's precious collection of books. Samuel Morrison had been a teacher back in Ohio before he caught gold fever. Now he drove their oxen team with dreams of striking it rich in California dancing in his eyes. "Papa, are we almost there?" asked Thomas, her 12-year-old brother. He poked his head out from under the canvas cover, his freckled face bright with excitement. "Still got a ways to go, son," Samuel replied, adjusting his worn hat. "But we're making good time. Should reach the valley before the first snow." Little Hannah, barely 2 years old, slept peacefully in her mother's arms despite the constant rocking and bumping. Elizabeth watched her baby sister's peaceful face and felt a pang of worry. The journey had been harder than any of them expected. They'd already lost one ox to sickness, and their food supplies were running lower than planned. The Morrison family had joined a small wagon train of 8 families back in Missouri, but one by one, the other wagons had taken different routes, or fallen behind due to broken wheels and sick animals. Now they traveled alone through the mountains of Northern California, following what they hoped was the right trail. "Samuel, I don't like the look of those clouds," Mary said, pointing to the dark sky gathering overhead. "Maybe we should find shelter and wait it out." Her husband glanced up at the threatening sky. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and the wind was picking up. "We'll push on a bit further. There's supposed to be a good camping spot just ahead where the trail levels off." But the storm hit faster than anyone expected. The first drops of rain turned quickly into a downpour, then into something even worse: wet, heavy snow mixed with sleet that made the rocky trail treacherous. The oxen struggled to keep their footing on the increasingly slippery path. Elizabeth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and hurried to help her father guide the team. The trail had become a nightmare of loose rocks and mud. Every step seemed dangerous. "I can't see the path anymore," Samuel shouted over the howling wind. "The markers are all covered with snow." The wagon lurched violently as one wheel hit a deep rut. Hannah woke up crying, and Mary held her close, trying to shield the baby from the stinging sleet. "Papa, I'm scared," Thomas called out. His voice was small and frightened now, not excited like before. "It's going to be fine, son. We just need to find that camping spot." But Elizabeth could hear the uncertainty in her father's voice. She knew they were in trouble. The trail was getting steeper and more dangerous with each passing minute. The oxen were starting to panic, their eyes rolling white with fear as they slipped on the icy rocks. Then it happened. The wagon hit a particularly bad patch where the trail curved sharply downward. The left rear wheel caught on a loose boulder, and suddenly they were sliding sideways toward the edge of the cliff. "Jump!" Samuel yelled. "Everyone jump!" Elizabeth threw herself from the wagon just as it tilted over the edge. She hit the rocky ground hard, her shoulder slamming into a sharp stone. Pain shot through her body, but she could hear the terrible sound of the wagon crashing down the mountainside, the splintering of wood, the screaming of the oxen, and worst of all, the cries of her family. She crawled to the edge of the cliff, her heart pounding with terror. Below, maybe 30 feet down, she could see the wreckage. The wagon had smashed against the rocks and broken apart. Supplies were scattered everywhere. One of the oxen lay motionless, while the other thrashed in pain with a broken leg. "Mama! Papa!" she screamed into the storm. "Thomas," a weak voice answered her. "Lizzie ... doubt me ... It was Thomas. She could see him trapped under part of the wagon's wooden frame. He was alive, but barely moving. Elizabeth found a narrow path down the rocky slope. She slipped and slid, cutting her hands on the sharp stones, but finally reached the wreckage. The sight that greeted her made her stomach turn. Her father lay twisted at an unnatural angle, his neck clearly broken. Her mother was pinned under the heavy wagon seat, her face pale and still. Baby Hannah. Elizabeth couldn't bear to look. She forced herself to focus on Thomas, who was conscious but trapped under a heavy piece of the wagon's frame. "It hurts, Lizzie," he whispered. "I can't feel my legs." "Don't worry, I'm going to get you out," she promised, though she had no idea how. The wooden beam was far too heavy for her to lift alone. For the next 2 days, Elizabeth worked frantically to free her brother. She used every tool she could find in the scattered supplies, a crowbar, wooden planks to use as levers, even her bare hands until they were raw and bleeding. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. The trail was covered with snow, and no other travelers would be coming this way for weeks, maybe months. Thomas grew weaker by the hour. Elizabeth gave him water and small pieces of food, but she could see the life fading from his eyes. On the second night, as she held his hand and told him stories about their childhood back in Ohio, he quietly passed away. Elizabeth was now completely alone. She had managed to bury her family as best she could, piling rocks over their bodies to protect them from wild animals. Her food was almost gone, and she had no idea which direction to go for help. She tried to climb back up to the main trail, thinking she might be able to signal for help, but the slope was too steep and dangerous. She was trapped in the valley with the wreckage of her old life scattered around her. On the third day, exhaustion finally overcame her. She collapsed beside the remains of the wagon, too weak to continue. The mountain wilderness stretched endlessly, in all directions, silent and unforgiving. She closed her eyes and waited for death to take her too, but death would not come just yet. Unknown to Elizabeth, she was being watched. High on a ridge overlooking the crash site, a figure stood motionless, among the pine trees, observing her struggle with careful, thoughtful eyes. Ayana had been tracking the wagon for 3 days before the storm hit. From his position high in the mountains, he could see the small family struggling along the dangerous trail below. His keen eyes, trained from childhood to spot the smallest movement in the forest, had noticed them when they were still miles away. He crouched behind a cluster of pine trees, his buckskin clothing helping him blend perfectly with the shadows. At 25, Ayana was considered one of the best hunters and trackers among his people. The Maidu, his grandfather had taught him to read the forest like other men read books. Every broken twig, every disturbed leaf told a story. But watching these white settlers made him uncomfortable. His tribe had good reason to fear and distrust people like them. Gold miners had been pouring into their ancestral lands for the past few years, bringing disease, violence, and destruction. They poisoned the rivers with their mining, scared away the game, and cut down the sacred oak trees that had provided acorns for countless generations. Just last spring, a group of miners had attacked a peaceful Maidu village, claiming someone had stolen their supplies. Ayana's own cousin had been killed in that raid, shot down while trying to protect the elderly and children. The tribal council had made it clear white settlers were enemies, not to be helped or trusted under any circumstances. So why was he following this particular family? Ayana watched as the father struggled to control the oxen in the growing storm. The mother held a small baby close to her chest, while a young boy peered out from the wagon with wide, frightened eyes. But it was the girl walking beside the wagon that caught his attention. She couldn't be much older than his sister, and there was something about the way she helped her family, the determined set of her shoulders, that reminded him of his own people's strength. When the storm intensified, Ayana found himself moving closer, though he stayed well hidden. He had a bad feeling about what was coming. The trail they were on was treacherous even in good weather, and with the sudden ice and snow, it had become a death trap. He was close enough to hear the father's shout of warning when the wagon began to slide, close enough to see the girl throw herself clear, just before the heavy wagon tumbled over the edge in a thunderous crash of splintering wood and terrified animal cries. For a moment, everything was silent except for the howling wind. Then came the girl's desperate screams for her family, a sound that cut through Ayana like a knife. He had heard that same kind of anguish before, the cry of someone who had lost everything in an instant. His first instinct was to help, but tribal law held him back. Getting involved with white settlers could bring disaster to his entire village. If other whites came looking for this family and found evidence that natives had been involved, there could be terrible revenge. His people had already suffered too much, but as the hours passed and he watched the girl struggle down the dangerous slope to reach her family, something inside him began to change. She worked with desperate determination, trying to free the boy who was trapped under the wreckage. She didn't give up even when it seemed hopeless. She didn't abandon her brother even when she could have saved herself. Ayana found himself remembering his grandfather's teachings about the deeper laws that governed all life. Sometimes, the old man had said, the spirits put us in a place where we must choose between the easy path and the right path. The easy path protects only ourselves. The right path protects the sacred balance of all things. For 2 full days, Ayana watched the girl's desperate battle to save her brother. He saw her use every tool she could find, working until her hands bled and her strength was nearly gone. He watched her give the boy water from her own dwindling supply, hold his hand when he was in pain, and sing to him through the long, cold nights. When the boy finally died on the second night, Ayana heard the girl's broken sobs echoing through the valley. The sound haunted him. He had seen death many times. It was part of life in the wilderness. But there was something about this girl's grief that touched a place deep in his heart. She spent the next day burying her family as best she could, piling stones over their bodies with her bare hands. She was clearly exhausted, moving like someone in a dream, but she didn't stop until the job was done. Even in her terrible grief, she showed respect for her dead dot. By the 3rd day, it was clear she was dying. She had barely eaten anything, and her body was shutting down from exhaustion and shock. She had tried several times to climb back up to the main trail, but the slope was too steep and slippery. Each attempt left her weaker than before. Ayana knew he had to make a choice. He could let nature take its course. The girl would die within hours, and no one would ever know what had happened to this family. His people would be safe from any complications. Or he could risk everything to save a life. He thought about his uncle, Chief Wanomi, who led their village with wisdom and caution. The chief had survived by making hard choices, always putting the safety of the tribe above individual feelings. He would not approve of what Ayana was considering, but he also thought about his grandmother, who had taught him that every life was connected to every other life in ways that were not always visible. When you save one, she used to say, you may be saving many. When you let one die who could have been saved, you may be letting many die. As the sun began to set on the 3rd day, Ayana watched the girl collapse beside the wreckage of the wagon. She lay still, her chest barely moving. Soon even that would stop. He made his decision. Moving silently through the forest, Ayana descended into the valley. He had committed himself to a path that would change everything, for himself, for the girl, and possibly for both their peoples. He didn't know what the consequences would be, but he knew he couldn't live with himself if he let her die when he had the power to save her. As he approached her still form, he whispered a prayer to the spirits of his ancestors, asking for guidance and protection for what was to come. The girl didn't stir as he gently lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body weakened by days of grief and starvation. Ayana carried her away from the crash site, toward a hidden cave he knew in the hills where she would be safe while he nursed her back to health. With each step, he moved further from the life he had known and closer to an uncertain future that would test everything he believed about right, wrong, and the bonds that could exist between enemies. Elizabeth woke up slowly, her mind foggy and confused. The first thing she noticed was warmth, something she hadn't felt in days. The second thing was the smell of wood smoke and something cooking that made her empty stomach clench with hunger. But when she tried to sit up, every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Where was she? This wasn't the cold, rocky ground where she had collapsed beside the wagon wreckage. She was lying on soft animal furs inside what looked like a cave. Firelight danced on the stone walls, and she could hear someone moving around nearby. Then she saw him. A Native American man sat by the fire, stirring something in a clay pot. He was tall and lean, with long black hair and strong features. His clothes were made of buckskin, decorated with beads and small shells. When he noticed she was awake, he turned to look at her with dark, serious eyes. Elizabeth's heart began to race with panic. Everything she had ever heard about Indians came flooding back, stories of raids, kidnappings, and violence. Her father had always said the only good Indian was a dead Indian. What did this man want with her? Why had he brought her here? She tried to scramble backward, but her weak body wouldn't cooperate. All she managed to do was make herself dizzy and sick. The man raised his hands slowly, palms facing her, and spoke in a calm, gentle voice. She couldn't understand the words, but his tone didn't sound threatening. He pointed to himself and said something that sounded like Ayana. Then he pointed to her and tilted his head as if asking a question. "Elizabeth," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My name is Elizabeth." He nodded and repeated it carefully. "Elizabeth." His pronunciation was careful, respectful. Ayana, she assumed that was his name, went back to the pot by the fire. He filled a wooden bowl with what smelled like soup and brought it over to her. When she shrank away, he set it down within her reach and backed away, giving her space. Elizabeth stared at the bowl. She was so hungry it hurt, but she was also terrified. What if it was poisoned? What if this was some kind of trap? But as the warm, rich smell filled her nostrils, her starving body made the decision for her. She grabbed the bowl and drank the broth desperately. Hardly caring if it killed her. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Some kind of meat and vegetable stew with herbs she didn't recognize. As the warm food hit her empty stomach, she felt strength begin to flow back into her body. Ayana watched her eat with what seemed like satisfaction. When she finished, he brought her water in a gourd cup and more food. This time it was some kind of flatbread made from ground acorns, along with dried berries and nuts. Over the next few days, a strange routine developed. Ayana would leave the cave early in the morning and return with fresh game, wild plants, or firewood. He never went far. She could often hear him moving around outside, but he always gave her plenty of space. He seemed to understand that she was still frightened of him. Slowly, they began to communicate. He would point to objects and say their names in his language, then listen carefully as she said them in English. Fire became Miwok, water became Mem. He was a quick learner, picking up English words faster than she learned his, but even as her body healed and her fear began to fade, Elizabeth was haunted by guilt and grief. Why was she alive when her family was dead? Why had this stranger saved her when she didn't deserve to live? At night she would wake up crying, remembering Thomas's last words or the sight of her parents' broken bodies. Ayana seemed to understand her grief without words. Sometimes he would sit across the fire from her and speak softly in his own language. She couldn't understand what he was saying, but the tone was comforting, like a prayer or a lullaby. Other times he would simply sit in respectful silence, letting her cry without trying to stop her. One morning, about a week after she had awakened in the cave, Elizabeth noticed that Ayana seemed troubled. He kept looking toward the cave entrance and listening intently to sounds she couldn't hear. Finally, he came over to her and spoke urgently in broken English mixed with his own language. "Men come," he said, pointing outside. "My people angry." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She had begun to trust Ayana, but the thought of facing a whole group of hostile Indians terrified her. What would they do to her? What would they do to him for saving her? Soon she could hear voices outside the cave, several men speaking rapidly in the same language Ayana used. The voices sounded angry, demanding. She heard Ayana's name mentioned several times and something that sounded like accusations. Ayana stood up straight and walked to the cave entrance. Elizabeth could see him silhouetted against the daylight, facing what looked like 5 or 6 other men. One of them, an older man with gray hair and many feathers in his headband, seemed to be the leader. He spoke to Ayana in sharp, commanding tones. Elizabeth didn't need to understand the language to know what was happening. The older man was angry that Ayana had saved her. He was probably the chief, and he wanted to know why one of his warriors had risked the tribe's safety for a white settler. The argument went on for what felt like hours. Sometimes voices were raised, sometimes they spoke in urgent whispers. Elizabeth caught a few English words that Ayana had learned: family, alone, help. He was trying to explain why he had saved her. Finally, the older man said something that sounded final and harsh. The other warriors began to leave, but the chief stayed for a moment longer. He looked into the cave, his eyes finding Elizabeth in the shadows. The look he gave her was not exactly hostile, but it was cold and calculating. She felt like he was weighing her worth against the danger she represented. Then he turned and followed the others, leaving Ayana standing alone at the cave entrance. When Ayana came back inside, his face was grim. He sat down heavily by the fire and spoke to her in the mixture of English and gestures they had developed. "Uncle angry," he said. "Says I bring danger." "Must choose? Choose what?" Elizabeth asked, though she already feared the answer. "Choose tribe or choose help you?" He looked at her with sad, serious eyes. "If I keep help you, cannot go home. Cannot see family again?" Elizabeth felt sick. This man had already saved her life, and now he was being forced to give up everything for her, his family, his people, his entire world. It wasn't fair. She wasn't worth such a sacrifice. "You should go back to them," she whispered. "I'll be fine on my own." But even as she said it, they both knew it wasn't true. Winter was coming, and she still didn't know how to survive in the wilderness. Without Ayana's help, she would die within days. Ayana was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but determined. "I choose help you," he said simply. "You are my people now, too." Spring arrived late in the mountains that year, and with it came danger that neither Elizabeth nor Ayana had expected. They had spent the harsh winter months in their hidden cave, learning to live together as outcasts from both their worlds. During those long, cold months, Ayana had taught Elizabeth everything he could about survival. She learned to identify which plants were safe to eat and which ones could heal wounds or sickness. He showed her how to track animals by their footprints in the snow, how to set snares for rabbits, and how to preserve meat so it would last through lean times. Elizabeth, in turn, shared what knowledge she had. She taught Ayana to read simple words, writing letters in the dirt with a stick by the firelight. She showed him how to count the way white people did, and explained things about the outside world that fascinated him. Cities with thousands of people, ships that could cross oceans, and machines that could do the work of many men. But as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared on the trees, their peaceful isolation came to an end. It started with rumors that filtered through the network of tribes throughout the region. White settlers were talking about a missing family, a man, woman, and 3 children who had vanished somewhere in the mountains. There was talk of a reward for information, and worse, talk of revenge if it turned out the Indians had been involved. Ayana heard these stories when he ventured out to hunt or gather supplies. Other natives would sometimes share news, though they no longer welcomed him as they once had. Word of his exile from Chief Wanami's village had spread, and many saw him as a traitor to his own people. "They're looking for you," he told Elizabeth one evening as they sat by their fire. His English had improved greatly over the winter months. "Men with guns, they think maybe Indians killed your family." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had almost allowed herself to forget about the world beyond their cave, to imagine that she and Ayana could live peacefully in their hidden valley forever. But the outside world was catching up with them. "What do we do?" she asked. "We move," Ayana said simply. "Find new place, farther from trails." So they packed their few belongings and left the cave that had been their sanctuary. Ayana led them deeper into the wilderness, to places where few people ever ventured. They moved constantly now, never staying in one spot for more than a few days. Elizabeth learned to live like a shadow in the forest. Ayana taught her to walk without leaving tracks, to cover their campfires so the smoke wouldn't be seen, and to recognize the signs that other people were nearby. She became stronger and more skilled with each passing week, but the constant fear of discovery wore on both of them. The first real trouble came in late spring. They had made camp near a stream in a remote valley, thinking they were safe. Elizabeth was washing their clothes in the cold water while Ayana hunted for fresh meat. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until it was too late. Well, what do we have here? Elizabeth spun around to find three rough-looking men standing at the edge of the clearing. They were clearly prospectors or miners with dirty clothes, scraggly beards, and the kind of hard eyes that came from too much time in the wilderness chasing gold that might not exist. "A white woman all alone out here," said the one who seemed to be their leader. He was a big man with a scar across his cheek and hands that looked like they were used to violence. "Now that's interesting." Elizabeth's heart pounded as she slowly stood up, water dripping from her hands. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Good day, gentlemen. I was just doing some washing." "Washing, eh?" The leader grinned, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Funny place for laundry. You wouldn't happen to be that Morrison girl everyone's been talking about, would you? The one whose family got themselves killed by Indians last fall?" Elizabeth's blood ran cold. How did they know her name? How much did they know about what had really happened? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice betrayed her fear. "Oh, I think you do." The man stepped closer. "There's quite a reward being offered for information about you, Missy. Dead or alive, though I suppose alive would be worth more." The other two men spread out, trying to surround her. Elizabeth looked desperately toward the forest, hoping to see some sign of Ayana, but there was nothing. "Now, here's what I'm curious about," the leader continued. "How does a white girl survive a whole winter in these mountains all by herself? Unless maybe she wasn't by herself. Unless maybe she had some help from the local savages." "I've been alone," Elizabeth lied. "I found shelter in a cave and learned to hunt." "Is that so?" The man laughed harshly. "You expect me to believe a soft little farm girl learned to survive on her own? No, I think you've been keeping company with redskins, which means you're probably not worth much as a reward anymore, if you catch my meaning." Elizabeth understood the threat perfectly. These men thought she had been living with Indians, which in their minds made her something less than human. They might kill her just for that, reward or no reward. She was preparing to run when she heard a sound that made her heart leap with relief. The distinctive whistle that Ayana used to signal his return. He had seen the strangers and was warning her, but the miners heard it too. "What was that?" one of them asked, reaching for the gun at his belt. "Bird call," Elizabeth said quickly, but they weren't fooled. "That wasn't no bird," the leader growled. "Boys, I think we're about to meet this girl's Indian friends." What happened next was a blur of violence that Elizabeth would never forget. Ayana emerged from the forest like a ghost, moving with deadly silence and speed. He had his bow in his hands and his hunting knife at his belt, but he was outnumbered and the miners had guns. The fight was brief but vicious. Ayana managed to wound two of the men with arrows before they could draw their weapons, but the leader got off a shot that grazed Ayana's shoulder. Blood began to stain his buckskin shirt, but he didn't slow down. Elizabeth watched in terror as the man she had come to care for fought desperately to protect her. She wanted to help, but she had no weapons and no experience with violence. All she could do was stay out of the way and pray that Ayana would survive. In the end, it was Ayana's knowledge of the forest that saved them. He used the terrain to his advantage, leading the miners into an area where loose rocks made footing treacherous. When one of them stumbled, Ayana struck with his knife. The other two, seeing their companion fall, decided the reward wasn't worth their lives and fled back toward the main trails, but the damage was done. Their hidden valley was no longer safe and Ayana was wounded. Worse, they both knew that the miners would return with more men and better weapons. "We have to go," Ayana sobbed, pressing a piece of cloth against his bleeding shoulder. "They will bring others." "Many others?" Elizabeth helped him gather their belongings, her hands shaking with leftover fear and adrenaline. As they prepared to flee deeper into the wilderness, she realized that their peaceful winter was truly over. From now on, they would be hunted by people from both their worlds, whites who saw her as a traitor, and Indians who saw him as an outcast. They were truly alone now, with only each other to depend on in a world that wanted them dead. 2 years had passed since the violent encounter with the miners, and Elizabeth barely recognized herself anymore. Her soft hands had become strong and calloused from years of survival work. Her pale skin was now bronzed by sun and wind, and she could move through the forest as quietly as Ayana himself. The frightened farm girl who had once cried for her lost family was gone, replaced by a woman who could hunt, track, and survive in the wilderness. She and Aya had found their sanctuary in a remote valley so hidden that even the most experienced mountain men would never stumble across it. A small stream provided fresh water year-round, and the surrounding cliffs offered protection from harsh weather and unwanted visitors. They had built a sturdy cabin from fallen logs with a stone fireplace that kept them warm through the winters. Their life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Ayana would hunt and fish while Elizabeth tended their small garden where she grew corn, beans, and squash using seeds he had saved from his tribal days. She had also learned to gather and preserve wild foods, and her knowledge of which plants could heal sickness had grown far beyond what Ayana had first taught her, but more than just survival skills had developed between them. The partnership born from necessity had grown into something deeper and more meaningful. They had learned to communicate not just with words, but with glances, gestures, and the kind of understanding that comes from facing hardship together. Elizabeth often found herself watching Ayana as he worked, noticing the careful way he carved arrows or the gentle patience he showed when teaching her new skills. He had given up everything for her, his family, his tribe, his entire way of life, and never once had he made her feel like she owed him anything. Instead, he treated her as an equal partner in their shared struggle to build something good. From the ruins of their old lives, Ayana, for his part, had discovered that Elizabeth possessed a strength he had not expected. She never complained about the hardships of their life, never spoke of wanting to return to civilization, and never blamed him for the isolation that his choice had brought them both. She worked beside him with determination and grace, and her quick mind had picked up his language and customs with remarkable speed. On quiet evenings by their fire, they would talk about their dreams and fears. Elizabeth would tell him stories about her childhood in Ohio, about her father's love of books and her mother's gentle wisdom. Ayana would share tales of his grandfather's hunting adventures and his grandmother's healing knowledge. Slowly, they were creating their own traditions, their own little world where the differences between white and Indian mattered less than the bonds they had forged. But their peaceful isolation couldn't last forever. One summer morning, as Elizabeth was picking berries near the stream, she heard the distant sound of wagon wheels and voices. Her heart jumped with a mixture of excitement and fear. It had been so long since they had seen other people that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to hear strangers talking. She hurried back to warn Ayana, who immediately began preparing to move their camp deeper into the mountains. They had developed a plan for this situation. Pack only the essentials and disappear until the travelers passed by. But as they listened to the voices getting closer, Elizabeth realized something different about these visitors. Among the rough male voices of the wagon drivers, she could hear something else, the sound of a woman singing hymns and children laughing. "It's a family," she whispered to Ayana. "Not miners or soldiers." Her curiosity overcame her caution. Against Ayana's worried protests, she crept closer to get a better look at the travelers. What she saw made her heart ache with unexpected longing. A wagon had stopped by the stream for water and rest. A middle-aged man was tending to the oxen while his wife, a kind-faced woman in a simple dress, was unpacking food for a meal. 3 children played by the water's edge under their parents' watchful eyes. They looked tired and dusty from travel, but there was something hopeful about them, something that reminded Elizabeth of her own family's journey so long ago. The woman looked up from her work and seemed to sense Elizabeth's presence. Their eyes met across the clearing, and for a moment neither moved. Then the woman smiled gently and raised her hand in greeting. "Hello there," she called softly. No need to hide. We're friendly folks. Elizabeth found herself stepping into the open, drawn by the first kind voice she had heard from her own people in over 2 years. The woman's husband reached for his rifle, but his wife placed a restraining hand on his arm. "I'm Rebecca Patterson," the woman said, her voice warm and welcoming. "This is my husband David, and these are our children. We're missionaries, heading west to start a school for Indian children." Elizabeth's throat felt tight with emotion. "I'm Elizabeth Morrison," she managed to say. The name seemed to ring a bell with David Patterson. His eyes widened with recognition. "Morrison? Are you—" "Weren't there reports of a Morrison family that went missing in these mountains a few years back?" Before Elizabeth could answer, Ayana emerged from the forest behind her. His bow was in his hands, but he held it casually, non-threateningly. David Patterson's grip tightened on his rifle, but Rebecca stepped forward with the same calm courage she had shown with Elizabeth. "And you must be the man who saved her life?" she said to Ayana. As if such things happened every day. Elizabeth was amazed by the woman's quick understanding and lack of fear. Most white people would have assumed the worst about seeing a white woman with an Indian man. But Rebecca Patterson seemed to see beyond the surface to the deeper truth of their situation. "How did you know?" Elizabeth asked. Rebecca smiled. "I've seen the way you two look at each other. That's not the look of captor and prisoner. That's the look of people who have been through hard times together and come out stronger." Over the next few hours, as the Patterson family rested by the stream, Elizabeth found herself telling their story. She spoke of the wagon crash, her family's death, and Ayana's incredible sacrifice to save her life. She told them about the years of hiding, learning to survive, and finding peace in their hidden valley. David Patterson, despite his initial wariness, gradually began to see Ayana as Elizabeth did, not as a savage, but as a man of honor who had given up everything to do what was right. The children, with the innocence of youth, quickly accepted both Elizabeth and Ayana, chattering excitedly about their plans to build a school where Indian and white children could learn together. As evening approached and the Patterson family prepared to continue their journey, Rebecca made an unexpected offer. "Why don't you come with us?" she asked. "We're going to establish our mission in a valley about 50 miles west of here. It's isolated enough to be safe, but we'll have a real community. You could help us with the school, Elizabeth. You could teach reading and writing, and Ayana, you could help the children learn about the land and traditional ways." Elizabeth felt her heart leap at the possibility. A chance to be part of something meaningful, to use her skills to help others, to live openly instead of hiding in the shadows. But she also felt the weight of uncertainty. Would other settlers accept them? Would Ayana be safe? She looked at Ayana, trying to read his thoughts. He was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer with the same careful deliberation he brought to all important decisions. "What do you want?" he asked her. Finally, Elizabeth realized that for the first time in years she had a real choice about her future. She could stay in their hidden valley, safe but isolated, or she could take a risk on building something larger and more meaningful. "I want to try," she said. "But only if you want it too," Ayana nodded slowly. "We try together." And so, as the sun set on another chapter of their unlikely story, Elizabeth and Ayana packed their belongings one more time. But this time, they weren't running from something. They were walking toward a new beginning, toward a future where their love and partnership could serve a purpose larger than just survival. Their journey from tragedy to redemption was far from over, but they would face whatever came next as they had faced everything else, together, as partners in a bond that had proven stronger than the prejudices and fears that divided their two worlds.